I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're speaking with Susan Snow Lukesh. She is a dedicated archaeologist turned family historian who meticulously deciphers her great-aunt Agatha Snow's 1912 European sketchbook to piece together a captivating journey of travel, history, and relationships. The book is called Agatha Snow Abroad, a sketchbook from her 1912 European tour. The author transports us back in time, providing us a detailed narrative on Agatha's trip, the people she met, and the aftermath of her travels amidst the unfolding of the First World War. We are delighted to have Susan join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Good River Print and Media for helping us put her in the spotlight today, and we ask viewers like you to support writers like her by subscribing to our channel. Susan, thank you so much for being our guest today on Spotlight.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Our pleasure, our pleasure. This is quite a gem you found, this book of sketches. When did you first find it? How long have you had it? When did you realize that this is something that could make a great book?
Well, I'll give you a little bit of history before that. After my colleague in archaeology retired, I was looking around for things to do, and family history was one. And I met up with my mother's cousin, and she was a family historian. And along the way, she first shared with me a 1860s Cartavisi photo album, which I studied and produced a book on. Then her daughter, who owns or has in her hands the original sketchbook, lent it to me to study. And that's where this came about. I started studying that after, I did the first book.
Gotcha.
So I don't have the sketchbook in my hands anymore. It's back to my cousin's daughter, but that's okay. I got a lot out of studying her.
And parts of the sketchbook have been reprinted in your book, correct?
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So tell us a little bit of story, tell the folks at home an overview of Agatha's life and why she was sketching and where she was going and all of that.
Well, Agatha was one of the second of 5 children of my great-grandmother. And she was incredibly artistic. The photo of her on the album came from a Kodak photo album that the family had, and she underlined it with an artist. So that's how she saw herself, as somebody who drew and created. She also was very, very educated and learned, as becomes clear when you're reading some of her captions. She will refer to Verdi's opera. She'll refer to other things. And she doesn't really tell you what she's referring to you. So that was part of my work in taking down what she was saying. She knew the proverbs well. It's fascinating to see her education and how she combined it with her, I would say, outlook on the people she saw and met. And I think we all know that when we travel, part of the fun of it is we're meeting people we don't know. They're not like the ones at home. And that's how she was approaching this, I believe. Although she didn't tell me that, but
right.
That's how I interpret it.
Tell us where she was traveling, the purpose of her journey, and how long she was doing this European tour.
The European tour was about 3 months. And in the back of the book itself is an itinerary. They started off in Holland, in Rotterdam. That's where the boat landed. And they went on from there. And I'm just turning to the pages now. They arrived in Rotterdam. They went to they were in the Netherlands very briefly. And then they went to Germany, from there to the Austrian-Hungary border, which is very interesting simply because that's where, World War I really erupted, was in that area. And then they went to Italy, came back and went to France, and then they went to the UK. So they covered in 3 months amazing, and I say today because he was traveling with 3 friends. They covered a major part of Europe.
Yeah. And I've seen some of the sketches. Describe some of them to the audience. What exactly did she sketch?
He primarily sketched people. He was fascinated with people. And it is worth studying her images to see how closely detailed he was able to get. There is one image that he drew of a place they visited, but I was able to find, and this is in 1912, and I was able to find an early 19th century print of the same place, and her detail was spot on to what the print was almost 100 years before. And so when you look at the people she drew, like the one entitled Salisbury Steak, and she presents a woman with enormous detail, including, a magnifier on a chain around her neck, which I'm sure that Agatha herself had with her, because some of the details she was able to create in her images for close-up, she couldn't have done with a naked eye. So we get to see bits and pieces of Agatha in the images she creates.
Yeah. Did you ever meet Agatha?
I did. She died in 1963 when I was a teenager, and I think I met her once or twice, but I knew nothing about this volume until about 6 years ago. So her sketchbook. Yeah. So we wouldn't have discussed it, unfortunately.
And did she keep a journal in addition to the sketchbooks?
No, just the sketchbook and her comments within it, which I have transcribed so people could read them, and tried to understand more by doing research on some of her elusive comments. Yeah. Like the image she has when she went to a London court toward the end of the trip, and her only comment is after she presents the judges and the back of her head, she says, cockroaches in the cabin, and that's all she said. And I thought, well, what is this? Is this some sort of, I don't know, is there a proverb? Is there a joke? What are cockroaches in the cabin? Finally, I turned to the London Times of 1912, and I discovered there was a 5-day trial of a woman who was suing because she said she had cockroaches in the boat captain.
That's interesting. That's interesting. But you did your research there, and you were able to make a correlation between the two events and give it some meaning and some significance. Did the sinking of the Titanic affect her trip at all?
I can't believe that it didn't, but there is no mention in her sketchbook. Since they left 2 days after it sank, there must have been people on the boat talking about it. But he does not record that, and so it's silent. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but understandable too. Because the people who were rescued from the Titanic didn't even come into the New York harbor until 2 days after her ship had left. So it was incredibly difficult time, and in her mind, she didn't want to pick up on what people were saying on the boat.
And also news did not travel that fast. People weren't tweeting about the Titanic sinking too, so there might have been limited information as well.
Well, honestly, I had studied the Titanic on an entirely different issue earlier. The New York Times excelled itself in getting information that night as it was going down.
Wow.
And it was, printed there, which is, why I, had this chapter with a fictional narrative, the only fiction in the whole book, talking about, the report, because it was much faster than you would have thought. But this was a glory day for the New York Times. And as I said, I just happened to have studied it for a different piece I was working on a few years earlier.
Yeah.
So
it's interesting. You're an archaeologist, correct?
yes.
So
Yes, I am.
is this one of the most interesting artifacts you've come across?
Yes and no. Very different, because my archaeology was in prehistory.
Okay.
And when my long-term colleague retired, he's obviously older than I was, because he was my graduate school advisor, and then we continued to work together. I needed something, and at that point, my family had been beckoning me, from the grave for years, and I thought, okay, time to do this, and so that's when I plunged head in. So but it relates to my interest in archaeology. Is this, which is recovering past lives.
Yeah.
In my prehistoric archaeology, there were no writings, so it was much more difficult. Now there are so many writings; it's difficult on another end.
Exactly.
Still, it's the same. It's the same instinct in me. Let's see what we can find out about the past.
Yeah, it's it would have been interesting if she took photographs. It would have been interesting if she had kept a journal. But it's wonderful that she made sketches. I think it's so much more personal. I think it's so much more unique. Don't you feel the same way?
Oh, I do. And, and in a way, it is a journal, because her comments relate to what she was seeing.
Mm-hmm.
And she puts the date in there, so we know she's here and she's seeing this. In one case, she mentioned something that was very, very odd to me at the time. And she points to someone she recognizes, whose name she gave is Delano Whistler. And I said, I thought, how did she recognize him, and who was he? I couldn't solve that problem before I published the book, but I did. And Delano Whistler was a descendant of Philip Delano, who arrived in Plymouth in 1621. And he was the nephew of one of my great-great-grandfathers, Francis Cook, who came over on the Mayflower. Delano came over in 1621. And along the way, he shared a grandfather with Whistler's mother, the Whistler we know from Whistler's mother. And he was a distant ancestor of Agatha, and for a time he lived in New Bedford. And New Bedford was a town where you knew everybody and you knew your relatives. So even if he was a distant relative, she knew that Delano Whistler, when she saw him in Europe, was a relative. Mm-hmm. And these connections are sort of fascinating. So she didn't give us a journal, but she gave us enough to recreate one.
Exactly. And it's a visual journal also, which is part of it. Yeah.
That is the treat of all. I mean, I can point to ones that I particularly enjoy for other reasons. One is titled Salisbury Steak, mm-hmm. in which she represents a woman who she presumably saw on the streets of Salisbury. And Salisbury steak was a U.S. invention in the 1890s. And so she sort of merges the amusement of Salisbury steak with this woman, who I call her well upholstered as a description. And she was also wearing a chain with a magnifying glass on it, which I'm sure that Agatha used, when she did her drawings, because some of them are so small you couldn't see it with a naked eye. And the other one I really enjoyed is one where it is entitled, "Have you seen Hunter?" ? And then there's a tall brother and a very short sister in Earl's Court in England. And she offers sound. And she does this by sketching in above the phrase, "Have you seen Hunter?" PPMS and CR for pianissimo, mezzo, benzo. So you can hear this small child screaming, "Have you seen Hunter?"
That's amazing.
The cleverness, to me, is just remarkable.
Absolutely, absolutely. She was a little bit of a groundbreaker in a way also when it comes to the feminist movement. This was quite a trip for three young ladies to be taking at the time, don't you think?
Well, yes and no. It is an interesting period, and there's an introduction to the book itself, which talks about women travelers, which go back a long way. But by the early 20th century, a lot of women were traveling on their own, and that's the story that really, I think needs to be brought out in another venue where she's a piece of it. These women were traveling. One of the women she traveled with continued to travel her whole life, and tracking her down because I hit all the people I could. She was on a plane in 1970. So, there are people who had travel in their blood, and they did.
Yeah, exactly. Well, we're glad.
Women and men.
Right, right. Did the study of contemporary postcards and early 19th century print add to the understanding of Agatha's drawings?
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of your sentence. Sorry, that
from viewing contemporary postcards and early 19th. Yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I tracked down as many, closely contemporary postcards of the period, and in fact, I found one that had been mailed to friends in New Bedford. So, it's a small community. That's another piece. How people knew each other. And not that the people, the postcard I found, would necessarily have known Agatha, but in tracking their history, I discovered that the woman who had written the postcard taught art in New Bedford, and I'd be surprised if Agatha didn't know her. So it's a fascinating way you can dig back into the past.
Absolutely. Can you describe the role of the Edwardian era in shaping her experiences abroad?
I haven't thought of it from that point of view, honestly, and it's something I could look into, but I didn't think of that. So that's unfortunate. I think there is very much, in terms of her shaping her opinion. She was fascinated by people who were different, that weren't necessarily what you see at home. And when we travel, we see that, and sometimes we enjoy it, and sometimes we say, I'm not sure I like that,
Right.
And I mean, I'm sure you've done a lot of traveling. I have too, and it's very important to put yourself in the context of other people's lives. So
absolutely, and you've done that with this book for sure. You have stepped into Agatha's shoes, no doubt. What role did public records and internet resources play in your research for the book?
Oh, a great deal. In terms of understanding what ship they sailed out of New York Harbor on, I knew they landed in Rotterdam, but in World War II, Rotterdam was so thoroughly bombed that there were no more records of ship passages or anything. But I fortunately found, I will tell you that Google is wonderful for finding things. And I found a gentleman who had retired from one of the shipping companies, and he had a website. And so I asked him about what ship would have landed in Rotterdam on the date that they did. And he was able to tell me exactly, when it, and it coincided with when they left New York. So that's part of the record. In terms of other records on family, when I wanted to, because she often gave full names of people that she drew pictures of and marked down their comments, which were often amusing. I traced those full names and found many of the people after the trip and after World War I, where some of them had gone, many of them had volunteered and been in there, and I was able to also trace down what happened to all three boats. There were the boats they went over, the boats they came back on, and a boat that her uncle and his son met. He came back on, and they had met them in England. So there are three boats, and what was their connection to World War I? And it's fascinating to see, the connections between people and over time, and I enjoy that enormously. It's apparently clear from my discussion.
Absolutely. Well, we know a lot from your book about Agatha's early life and her young life. What's the end of the story? What did she grow up, if you will, to become, and what was the rest of her life like? If we cut to the chase a little bit, for like a epilogue.
She never married. She worked. I'm trying to figure out. She did a lot with artistic things, and she developed scenery for local plays and in the Boston area from New Bedford. So she kept herself busy doing that. I think I've often thought it's such a pity that she couldn't have been a caricaturist for the local paper.
Mm.
She could have, but she probably would have skewered people in town.
Exactly. A dangerous thing to do in a small town. It must have been
absolutely when everybody knows your name.
Exactly.
Where you come from.
Exactly. There's so much of New Bedford, Massachusetts that seems unchanged since 1912, which must have been kind of nice going back there and seeing these buildings and these streets and knowing that Agatha walked on them at one point in her life. And actually her whole life, right?
Oh, yes. No, she was born, lived, and died there. I will mention that there's, Agatha's grandmother, Abby Tabor Hunt, had a house that her father, built for her across the street from his. After she married, her husband died young. He had what was then called consumption, but we now know is tuberculosis. Many people did have it in those days. And so at that point, Agatha took her daughter, who is my great-grandmother, back across the street to live with her father. The house then was rented out by a woman who was the sister of Herman Melville, and Herman Melville came in and spent summers there, to the point that some people muttered it was, Melville's library. And ultimately, it was owned by succeeding generations. And about 6 or 7 years ago, I found out that it was owned by a young couple, and they were renovating it. So I reached out to them, and they are just wonderful people. They now have a bed and breakfast there, called the Whale House is their bed and breakfast is part of it. So this life keeps regenerating. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It keeps increasing of interest. And that too is fascinating. And it's been lovely for me to meet them and visit the house. And in fact, walk up to the Widow's Walk and look across to the harbor. It's just, you mentioned New Bedford. It's a very small, tight community, which welcomes outsiders, but they also know their history. And that's something you don't necessarily see in a lot of places.
Yeah, it's a beautiful corner of New England, and you have captured it well in your book. The name of the book is Agatha Snow Abroad, a sketchbook from her 1912 European tour. It is written by Susan Snow Lukesh, and it is an amazing book that is based upon a series of sketches made by her great aunt back in and around the year 1912 as she traveled through Europe. Susan, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Crawford. I appreciate the attention to Agatha. That means a lot to me.
Oh, I appreciate it. It's a fascinating story. I loved hearing about it and learning about it. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.